Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the You Got the Ron Dude podcast. I'm your host Ron Jam, and thank you very much for tuning in. You can stream this episode for free on YouTube and SoundCloud, where you can also download it for free. A while back I recorded an episode called My Thoughts on the Carlos Mencia controversy. Mainly about, his confrontation with Joe Rogan almost 20 years ago on that stage in the Comedy Store. And I want to do a follow-up because I'm a big fan of both. And it sucks that these guys, I don't think they've ever run into each other since. And both still stick to their guns, which I understand. But it's just a shame that they couldn't move on from it. I'll get into that more, but because, they could talk about the old days and stuff and comedy. But I have some ideas. I don't know if I talked about them in that episode, but I've been watching, I'm a huge Mencia fan, and he makes a lot of good points about stuff. Because even if somebody comes to him and be like, hey, I tell a joke that's similar, and can we, dig through the archives, see who did it first? Because he says, if that happens, and oh, you did it first. Now, that doesn't mean it was stolen, but, he'll stop doing it, or they can work it out financially or whatever. And lately, all the interviews that I've watched with Carlos, except for one, he did this half an hour one recently. I can't think of the name, but it was at a comedy club. But otherwise, he's just reiterating all the same stuff over and over. And I feel bad because, dude, you've made your case. You've made all the same points over and over again. And I get it, different platforms and stuff, but for a big fan like me, it's kind of I wish they'd ask him about other stuff, because it's not on him. It's just, that poker podcast, the first thing he brings up is Joe Rogan. Not, how did you get the residency in Vegas? Tell us about your latest special. The big gap between specials and that, because his last one was in 2011, New Territory. But instead, it just seems like the whole conversation, on these episodes, on these podcasts and interviews are mainly about that. But I think Carlos has done a great job defending himself, but also explaining his side of things. Because you watch that video from 2007, it's okay, but you're not getting context. And he explains, the wall joke and that, and Cosby. But I'll get into that. But Brian Redban was recently on the Not a Damn Chance podcast with Philip Franklin Lee. And they had a segment about that because he said, I'm responsible for canceling the first cancellation online. And he says, and this is what gets me, is he says that I kind of feel bad for the guy. Because, he'll have a show at a club, and then all the comments will be, whose jokes are you doing, and joke thief and that, and it's so wait, this is what you wanted, right? The nerve to say, I kind of feel bad. It's no, you guys set out to destroy his career. So to backtrack like that, it's well, then call off the dogs. And to me, that's just a big F you. Like that, it's how dare you? It's you filmed it, you put it out, and there was going to be a part 2. But with me, it's well, how do you track who did a joke first? Two people can have the same idea. Because in that video from 2007, Rogan says oh yeah, I was in Vegas, I saw this guy doing this joke, and I must have been oh, that's where he got it from. It's how do you determine that? Just because somebody did it first, or no, Ari Spears said, just because you saw someone do it first, let's say you go to a comedy club, and then you see another comedian do a similar joke, and it's oh, they must have stolen it from them. It's whoa, whoa, whoa. And especially if it's an easy joke like the wall, who's going to build it, but for Redban to say that, I thought that's really cheap. And when he said, I think he's seen Carlos a few times in that, but we'd have to hear Mencia's side of things. But I thought that was just pretty lame to say something like that. I kind of feel bad for the guy. It's like, really? Then do something about it. Call off the dogs, admit you were wrong, or just say, well, we've moved on, but the internet hasn't. And, 07, keep in mind, YouTube launched in 2005, 20 years ago. So even in 07, YouTube's still in diapers. But that thing blew up, but like Carlos said, he could have said the same thing about Joe. He could just lie and say, you're a joke thief. And yes, I know about Joe and him being accused, but we'll get to that. Oh, that is next. Here we go. And Carlos said when Joe was accused of stealing Brendan Schaub's joke, like, he didn't jump on that. I thought back and I was like, well, wait, didn't you? On Vlad's podcast? But, oh no, he just informed Vlad about it, but he didn't say, see? Hypocrisy. But no, he just let him know, and he said, like, this is my greatest fear, because all these comics are just going to be accused, one after another, of stealing material. Now, when it's word for word, I understand. But otherwise, it's like, really? Because, like, personal stories, things that happen, you're like, oh, I've never heard that before. But, like you said, if you sit, like, 10 comics in a room, give them all a newspaper, well, a digital paper these days, it's like, they're going to come up with some of the same bits. And that's not an excuse, that's just the way it is. But I think it was on a recent episode with Jordan Peterson on JRE, and Joe actually brought up because he felt bad about, going after comics in that way, because he still stands by what he did with Mencia, but because I'm like, really, you never went after anybody else, even on a lower level. This guy just pissed you off. I'd still love to know what happened, because it wasn't just the joke thing. But also on the Flagrant podcast, he said, like, well, at that time, it's just, everybody's hungry for work and success. And, like, both of these guys, had shows and specials and that. So I don't think it was competitive. Maybe in comedy, because Joe, I mean, he's always been known as a stand-up in that. That's one of his things. But I don't know what the falling out was. But he said he felt bad at that time, just all the noise and hate. And me, I'm like, dude, you're a comic. Make it funny. Why didn't he just make fun of him? To the point where it was like, dude, we need to sit down and talk about this. I didn't steal jokes. And how do you prove who did something first? And if he's in the back of comedy clubs writing stuff down, like you said, it's like, so you're watching him? How do you know what he's writing? Stuff like that. Now, keep in mind, I'm very aware, because Carlos has said this on a podcast, maybe one of his, because he said that, with jokes, somebody could come to him, kind of like I said earlier, and they'd be like, oh, I have a similar joke, and Carlos says, he's been recording all the shows since 93, 94, so go back, and again, not that it's theft, but it's all like, oh, you did do it first, because when he talked about George Lopez, and I think it was the Enchilito joke, and he says, when George confronted him, because George was saying like 13, 14 minutes of material, but he hasn't addressed that specifically, so I'm not sure about that. Maybe he just wanted in with the group, to pile on Carlos, but Mencia said, really, you want to claim Enchilito a Taco Bell joke? And he said, looking back, George had been doing it longer, so he should have just dropped it, let it go. Because even if, like, it wasn't stolen, it's still like, well, we have similar jokes, and you know what? Out of respect, I'm going to let you have this. And to me, it's like, okay, great, we can move on from that. Okay. So, I think the way that Louis C.K. and Dane Cook handled it is great, because ever since then, I haven't seen, any waves regarding the joke theft. Because Louis accused Dane of stealing material, and then I think Louis wrote something for his show, for his series, and then Dane came in and they settled it, and that was it. I think Joe and Carlos could do that. Now, both still stick to their guns. I don't think either is going to be like, yeah, I stole, or no, I lied, you didn't steal, I was just jealous. Nothing to make up. I mean, like, write like fiction, but just have them sit down and maybe each of them writes out a script or something, and then they each perform the other, the other side now. Like, we'll do mine first, and we'll do yours, and see where we get. And just to move on. Because obviously these guys, I'd love to see Carlos on Joe's podcast, but I don't see it happening unless one of them is just like, you know what, F it. I was wrong, I messed up. But they have a change of heart, or I don't know what it would take. Because when Joe had Bob Saget on, rest in peace, I think about 5 years ago, Bob said he wasn't really familiar with what was going on with that, and I think he said, like, do you hate the guy? And Joe said something really nice. He says, no, I hope he's doing well. I hope he's doing real well. And, because you consider there haven't been accusations since, not on that level. Because Red Band said on that podcast I mentioned, yeah, I heard he still steals. And it's like, dude, where are your receipts? Who told you that? Have them on. But nope, just, I heard he still does that. It's like, okay, but then why would you feel bad? So I just don't believe, and it's nothing. I know Joe has been going through a lot of controversy the last, 5 years since, the Spotify deal and all the politics. Now, all that stuff aside, like I said, I'm a fan of both of these guys, Joe and Carlos. So it's a shame we can't just patch things up and move on, agree to disagree, move on. But there's got to be more to it on Joe's side. So I hope one day he opens up about it, because I wrote this down. Check out Carlos and Gabe Lopez's podcast, Between the Laughs, on YouTube or wherever you find your podcasts. Episode 19A, because there's a 19B, because Gabe asks him about this stuff. And the part that intrigued me, because I've heard all the other stuff, like I said, I've heard him talk about before. And he tells the same, stories and reasoning and all that. And I think it's good for people to hear, but I've just heard it, a lot. But he mentions when he and Joe first met, he says, I remember. Because Carlos was working the door, Joe introduced himself, and Carlos, now this is according to Mencia. I'd love to hear Joe's side of this, because what he said is real interesting. But they had just met. So Carlos apparently said, just so you know, the comics in there think I'm a joke thief. Because he would emulate people, because his introduction to stand-up comedy was doing stand-up comedy. So he didn't have any stand-up heroes or anything. It's one of those. Keep in mind, this is 88. So the Boston comedy boom is coming to an end, within the next couple years. And no social media at all. Very little computers in homes. But just to kind of paint a picture for you. And Joe had said, I've seen you on stage in that. Your stuff is different, because it just seemed like he was more reasonable at that time. But now that intrigued me, because Carlos basically told him, just so you know, they think I'm doing that, but... And then Joe saying, oh, no, I've seen you, and it's different in that. And like I said, with jokes, when it's word for word the same, that is suspicious. But otherwise, it's people are going to have, the same points of view, and, same stories sometimes, but there's, a twist. But I want to know, because Carlos said years ago, they were friends. I don't know if they were just cool in passing, or if they would hang out. Or no, he said they would hang out, because they would play pool and stuff, and go out to eat and that. And I'd just like to know, when did the falling out come? Because it sounds like it wasn't Carlos who had a falling out with Rogan. It was the opposite. But I don't know if we're ever going to get that complete, honest story from Joe. Because, like he said, in those days, I mean, the 90s, early 2000s, that's very competitive. There's no podcast boom or anything. Podcasts have been around since, the iPod. That's why they called it the iPodcast. But now that there's, enough for everybody, it's like, because you never went after anybody else. Joke thieves, you're just like, oh no, it's similar, but whatever, you just let it go. And it's like, you picked this guy. And I hope Joe, has watched interviews now with him, because Carlos, he clarifies the story about he thought he had an uncle who was German, but the spelling was a little bit different, so they dropped that. And, his birth mom is Mexican, and just the stuff with his name and that, it's like, wait, if this is about jokes, okay, but otherwise it's like, I just want to know, I want to pick Joe's brain about, dude, what was your problem? And, episode 1 of Between the Laughs, really emotional. They had Juan Villarreal on there, who's a hilarious guy, really insightful. You could talk to him about anything. And I'm surprised they didn't bring up, or I don't think they did, but this is really important as well, because I believe in 94, Carlos gets a call from Juan, and he said, hey, are you going to be in San Antonio or wherever soon, or Corpus Christi, something like that. And he said, no, why? And he said he got paid a bunch of money to do 45 minutes, but he didn't have that much material, so he did Carlos stuff. And apparently that was the genesis, or part of it, as far as the joke stealing. That's one thing I want to, put that in front of Rogan and be like, did you know about this? Because when he met Carlos was emulating other comics, and he says, eventually you shed that, because it's hard to get rid of mannerisms and that, But that being said, I feel like Carlos has been really open about everything. And another solution I have, an idea, is Carlos having comics on who've accused him. And even if they've already cleared it up, because it sounds like he's had phone calls now with people over the years, and they're like, oh no, I didn't say you stole from me. I just said, I heard you did that. And it's like, well, you're on this radio station saying I took your bit. But I don't think comics would do that, because that toxicity, that nature of toxic, it's like once they jump that ship, people are going to be like, oh, you're siding with a joke thief? And it's like, because he said, give me a call, email, whatever. But I just hope that, like with Cosby, for example, have him on the podcast. He's out of prison, and they could just reiterate what they talked about on the phone or in person all those years ago. And there's a good explanation for why that joke, the Hi Mom one, was even on his special. It wasn't supposed to be, but you'll have to listen to episodes 19A and B. Because here I am saying all the stuff I've already heard. But I just think it's important, because either of these guys could come out and be like, oh shoot, I remember, like Carlos could say, oh, that joke, I don't remember how I wrote it, so maybe I heard something and then elaborated on that. Or Joe could say, dude, I was jealous. You're a bigger comic than I was. We were both well known, but you had all these specials and you're doing movies and such. But just like having comics on the podcast, I don't see that happening, because like Joe would face extreme backlash. I think cancellation if he, didn't stick to his guns. But that being said, this whole thing, even though, like I said, I'm a fan of both of them, I try to see where both are coming from. What happened was good for comedy, because it's like, hey, this internet thing is taken off. And you're accused of something, and it's going to live forever on here. But Carlos, he's been really positive and influential as far as not going after comics and only helping them in that. But again, I don't want to sound, because you kind of have to, when you're a fan of both, it's like, well, I want to defend both sides, but with Joe, it's like, I wish he would talk about when they met and hanging out, and then, like, what was it that triggered him? Because he's on stage, and it's like, dude, don't go after his opener. I think it was Kirk Fox saying this guy opens from Menstelia. It's like, dude, don't be a bitch about it. And, in the old days, like Carlos has said, they would settle things, behind the scenes and that. Be like, if you have a problem with me, come talk to me. Because, the George Lopez thing was always blown out of proportion as far as the confrontation. Like, yeah, you threw him up against a wall, they exchanged punches. It's like, no. Carlos said, like, George, grabbed him in that by his collar. But I think his wife was there, and Carlos is like, you really want to do this? But that's one of those things. That's the thing with stories. It's like you want to tell your side of it, but anyways, check out Between the Laughs episodes 19A and B, and actually check out all of them so far. It's really entertaining. And Gabe Lopez, he's out there in Vegas, where Carlos does his residency, but the point of this is just, I say do the Louis C.K., Dane Cook resolution kind of thing, because that hasn't gotten any traction since, I believe. Amy Schumer, I don't know where that stands. I think that's still pretty strong. Like, she hasn't done a lot recently, but like she did, some movies and that. But some of those bits, those I couldn't really defend when she's, they have her telling like the same thing as Mulaney and Patrice. But how do you track who did a joke first? It's in a special, it's on TV, it's on the radio. It's like, okay, but who took from who? But those ones are very similar. But again, I mean, this has to play out in court someday, The other thing is Carlos inviting comics on, and make it public, not like challenging them like, hey, you said this about me, or you piled on, so come on the podcast. But I would do a Twitter thing. Because Patrick Bet David had Carlos on about 4 or 5 years ago. And he had said, like, I'd call out Rogan on, or not call out in a bad way, but just, say, hey, Joe, I'd love to do the podcast. And it's like, oh, he's done that. He's open to it. He's not hiding from anything. But I think this would be another great way to, a way to move on from stuff. Because he could have someone on who's like, dude, you took that bit from me. That was my first time doing it. I remember you were there. And they could agree to disagree. Or just move on. It's, it's kind of like, well, I remember writing that. And I just happened to have a similar bit. Or vice versa. Carlos is like, no, I did that. You saw me do it. But I hope one day all this is put to rest. Both of these guys are extremely talented. They're not known for one thing. Mind of Mencia, I want to see that on streaming. And he mentioned some comedy radio station that doesn't play his stuff. The fact that Comedy Store Doc, they didn't even reach out to him. That says a lot on their side. I think they're being pretty weak about that. Because if Carlos had was taken to court over things like, well, you profited off these people, it's like, where's the proof? Where's the receipts? Because then I can understand, dude, we're not going to have you in this doc, but to just leave him out of stuff, not even contact him, it's like, really? Because to me, that's suspicious on their part. It's like, if you don't like the guy, fine, but comedians right now, good gosh. It's like, who's not getting in trouble for stuff? Accusations. Oh, you sold out. Your fans, you call them poor and all that stuff. And me, it's just like, just make stuff funny. Wow, about 25 minutes in. I thought I was going to talk for a few minutes. I was just going to pitch those 2 ideas and that was it. But all I'm saying is context. And just remember, when you accuse someone of something, it's like, well, you heard this. And obviously where there's smoke, there's fire. But it's like, well, yeah, but just remember, when these guys met and Carlos said to him, by the way, they think I do this. And Joe saying like, oh no, I've seen you. But from Carlos, I hope that comics could come on his podcast and they could just hash it out and be like, oh no, you didn't take from me, I just heard you did. But I just don't let it reach the 20 years from that video. Because, Joe, you remember Joe on O&A, he was furious. He was pissed. And this is going back before that video. Early 2000s, he's writing blogs about Carlos, trashing him on radio station. It's like, dude, make it funny at least. But it bothered you so much, and it's like, you gotta be jealous about something. Like this anger, this hatred, and it's like, his name's Ned, it's not Carlos. He's not even Mexican, he's German. And it's like, wait, what does that have to do with being a joke thief? But he was just like furious, and it's good that he doesn't do that. He hasn't done it since. But it's like, well, of course not, dude. You got all the money you need, and your podcast blew up. And look, like I said, I'm a fan of Joe's. I think the podcast growth, it's been organic, and it's been awesome to watch him hit these high numbers in that. And I know there's a lot of pushback with, like, oh, well, you don't challenge people on this and that. It's like, well, a conversation, interview, and you're learning about people, but, fear factor, commenting on the UFC and stuff. And he just seems like a guy, you can talk to him about anything. So I don't want you to think like it's nothing against Joe, except for when it comes to this. Because it's that one target, and you never seek out any others again. So I just hope we hear his side of things in depth. And he's had Brendan Schaub on. I think they did a Fight Companion, and I don't think the joke theft thing was brought up. But that's that being gay thing, like, that's an easy one to write. It's like, it'd be awesome, we just hang out, we F, and, all right, I'm going to sleep, I'm going to eat chips and stay up, and, like, that joke's been done many times. So I wouldn't even say he stole it from Schaub, or you could say Schaub stole it from somebody else, but it's just one of those, like, that's an easy joke. Because there's no real point of view, it's not based in reality, it's just like, what if? But, and Carlos, with Mina Mencia, hosting all those comedy shows on TV and bringing up all these people, and I want these guys to be friends, that's all. Can't we just move on? Can't you guys just hug? And because I don't expect them to, like, I could see them shaking hands and that, but just move on and be like, just call off the dogs, because I don't know. It just sucks that these guys aren't still friends. Or at least keep, like maybe every few years they'd get on a podcast and be like, dude, do you still think I do that? And, oh man, I was just jealous. But I don't know, because I don't know how big of a deal this is to both of them. As far as like, obviously it impacted both their careers, but they both moved on. Joe started his podcast a couple years later, and it just sucks. And two people, you're like, I'm a big fan of both, but it's also like, well, the way one person handled this, I wasn't a fan of. And the other one was more professional, just moved on from it, didn't address it. But then, of course, YouTube just continued to grow. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if Carlos and or Gabe hears this, I love the podcast you guys are doing. And when you have comics on, I can't wait. Or whomever. Not that you guys are boring or anything. It's just that you're two comics and you guys could have, a bunch of stories about, doing the road and specials and such. But in my position, it's hard to say, because it's like you don't want to defend people you're a fan of. But in this case, I'm just saying, like, just hear everyone out on everything. And, go down a rabbit hole and be like, oh, there's no proof of this or that. And, like, who are these comics? And But hopefully one day it won't be a thing anymore, and they'll talk about, remember when that was a thing. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I'd love to hear from you. Like, subscribe, follow, rate, review, share, all that fun stuff. And stream for free on YouTube and SoundCloud, where you can also download. Oop, my phone had shut off. Or the screen had turned off. Okay. You know what? I'm going to leave that in. If you heard some clicking, sorry about that. But anyways, thanks for listening. And I hope this inspires you to do some digging, and maybe, something like this blows up, or the episodes of their podcast, the Between the Laughs, blows up, and people are like, we want to hear more about this. But thanks again. I will see you next time on the You Got the Ron Dude podcast.